Welcome to the 13th installment in our Where in Elan series. Today, we are covering the second book in the Riyria Chronicles series, The Rose and the Thorn. This book takes place about 1 year after the first book in the series, The Crown Tower. We do get to use our standard Elan world map for this one, but we aren't going to need much of it for this book. But since over 90% of the book happens in the city of Medford, we're actually going to do something a little different and include the Medford City map so that this video isn't 30 seconds long. The book starts out with the boy, Reuben Hilfred, as he is accosted by some of the young squires near the castle. He runs to the stables where he works, and shortly after, Princess Arista shows up, and Reuben and her ride out of the city, towards the Gateway Bridge. Prince Alric and Morven and Fannin Pickering show up, and they end up chasing Arista back to Medford, while Reuben walks home alone. Meanwhile, Royce and Hadrian are traveling north, just outside of Colnora, when a woman stops them, and they end up meeting Viscount Albert Winslow. They end up deciding that the three of them will work together, and they start to travel back north towards Medford. Back at Essendon Castle, King Amrath is meeting with his council, including Percy Braga, Simon Exeter, and Leo Pickering. Reuben is splitting wood at the castle when he is again accosted by the squires, but this time Alric, Fannin, and Morven show up and save him. The four boys decide to go frog hunting in a swamp past the King's Road towards Eastmarch. After hunting, they return to the castle. Reuben sees a light on in the haunted tower and sees a woman climb out of the tower window. He helps her get down, and it ends up being Rose. A little later that night, Richard Hilfred, who is Reuben's father, Exeter, and Sergeant Barnes are investigating the missing woman, and Barnes falls to his death after climbing out of the window. Royce and Hadrian arrive in Medford and see a public hanging in the Gentry Quarter. The pair then travel through the Artisan District and into the lower quarter to Medford House, where they want to see Gwen but are refused. So they go across the street to the Hideous Head. Then Royce catches a member of the Crimson Hand named Puzzles, who has been watching them. Reuben is getting outfitted to become a soldier at the smithy, and then arrives at the castle, briefly sees Arista, and then goes into the dungeons to see Rose, who is hiding there. He leaves, briefly runs into Ulrich and the Pickerings, and then arrives back at the barracks, where he lives with his father. Royce, Hadrian, and Puzzles drop off Albert at a barber in the Merchant Quarter, and then head over to the Crimson Hand Cemetery, where the Thieving Guild has its hideout. Royce and Hadrian talk to Top Hat, the leader of the Crimson Hand, where they learn that Simon Exeter had beaten Gwen. The pair then head back to Medford House. After dispatching some thugs, they finally talk to Gwen. During this whole time, Albert had visited a barber and a clothes shop in the Merchant Quarter, then some more expensive shops in the Gentry Quarter, and finally visited Lord Dareth in the northwest section of the quarter. He then returns to the Hideous Head, where he meets Royce and Hadrian, and they discuss Albert's plan to attend the party at the castle that night. Then they later travel to Gentry Square and discuss the nobility and Royce's plan to kill Exeter. Reuben goes down to the dungeons to see Rose again. He then goes to the castle's front gates for his guard shift and stands his post as guests arrive for the party, including Albert. Alric, Fannin, and Morven use this moment to leave the castle with Reuben's help, and they head towards the swamp. In the castle, Amrath, Queen Anne, and Arista go to the party. After some mingling, Bishop Salder comes in and takes Amrath to the upstairs chapel to tell him he suspects Exeter of treason. Richard arrives to bring Amrath back to the party. Hadrian and Royce take a carriage from the lower quarter to the Hollowed Sword Tavern on Merchant Square. They go into the tavern, get the driver drunk and put him in a room, and then take the carriage. Meanwhile, Albert is at the party getting a job. King Amrath and Leo Pickering break up another fight between the Earls of Longbow and Westmarch and leave the castle to bring them home. Royce and Hadrian, who have arrived at the castle, see them leave. Arista is fighting with her mother in the castle before bed. Once that is done, Richard leaves and then overhears Saldor and Exeter. He interrupts and Exeter leaves. Richard and Saldor then go down to the dungeon to see Rose, and Saldor tells Richard to get her out of the castle. Richard leaves with Rose, passing by Reuben, telling him not to tell anyone that they saw him. Royce and Hadrian see Rose and Richard leave the castle. Hadrian decides to go after them, while Royce stays. They pass under the tradesman arch into the artisan quarter. There's a fight in which Hadrian helps. They then go past the central square fountain of Artisan Quarter. They reach the lower quarter, and Richard tells Hadrian to stay there. Back at the party, Albert gives Exeter a predetermined speech about coming to the carriage. Exeter sends out guards to check, who return with a note saying that Exeter should get in the carriage alone and tell the driver to take him to the graveyard in the merchant quarter. Exeter goes to the carriage and decides to get in the carriage alone, but first tells his guards to pull his men from Gentry Square and tell them to split up and walk to the cemetery. Exeter then goes back into the castle to get his sword, lets Albert go, and then goes back and gets in the carriage and tells the driver to go to the cemetery. The driver, who is actually Royce, takes them to Gentry Square and stops, then gets in the carriage and puts a knife to Exeter's throat. Hadrian, who's at the gate to the lower quarter, fights 4 men, and then he proceeds to the central square and then to Medford House. He finds that Rose never made it there. He goes back down Wayward Street and in an alley finds Rose's body. He takes her body back to Medford House and then leaves to find Royce. In Gentry Square, Royce has tied up Exeter to the statue of Tolan Essedin and begins torturing and murdering Exeter. Richard arrives back at the castle. He asks Reuben about the royal family's whereabouts, but Reuben lies to him. Richard goes back into the castle. The guests begin leaving, but then begin to leave very quickly as a fire has broken out in the castle. This includes Albert, who goes to Lord Darreff's house. Reuben rushes to the castle to save Arista, but is stopped by his father, who states that the royal family is going to die. Reuben rushes past, but finds the doors have been chained shut. Reuben realizes his father is behind the fire. Hadrian arrives back at the castle and watches it burn. Braga is at the castle and attacks Richard, giving Reuben time to escape. He leaves to grab an axe to break in. Braga comes out and says that he has killed Richard, but that the fire has spread and no one should enter. Reuben fights his way in and is able to save Arista. At Arista's urging, he goes back into the castle to save the queen. The fire is much worse now, but just as he is about to die, a mysterious voice seems to help him, guiding him out. Hadrian leaves watching the castle burn and goes to Gentry Square. There, he finds the mutilated body of Exeter. He then goes back to the Hollowed Sword Tavern in Merchant Square and finds the carriage, but not Royce. He heads back near the castle and enters the Artisan Quarter. At the center square, he finds the body of Stain, the same as Exeter. He then goes back to the lower quarter and finds the body of Raynor Grew in the center square. Later that night, guards come and arrest Gwen and the women of Medford House. Royce sees them go on Wayward Street. And then Hadrian walks up, and the pair break into the Hideous Head to discuss how to save the women. Just before dawn, Percy Braga is meeting with what remains of the council, including Saldor. Then, Amrath, Leo, Alric, Fannin, and Muavin all arrive back into Medford. Leo and Amrath had been at Drondel Fields, and they had picked up the 3 boys along the road on their way back. Albert leaves Lord Darreff's that morning and goes to the Hideous Head, where Royce orders him to give a coin purse to Bishop Saldor. Saldor is just getting back to Mayor's Cathedral when Albert comes and gives him said coin purse, which contains Exeter's finger, and a note telling him to protect the women of Medford House. Albert immediately goes back to the Hideous Head, where Royce orders him to go collect information in case the women are to be executed. Amrath and his children are still at the burned castle, and Amrath meets with his council, where it is decided that the women will not be blamed for Exeter's death. Albert returns to the Hideous Head to let Royce and Hadrian know that they are to be released. They then meet the women as they return. Reuben awakes and is being tended to by Dorothy, a midwife. After a while, Saldar comes and visits him to see what Reuben knows. 3 days into his recovery, Amrath also arrives with his children and Braga and speaks to Reuben, thanking him. Royce, Hadrian, and the women of Medford House walk to the Crimson Hand Cemetery to bury Rose. Fast forward, and Royce and Hadrian are leaving to go complete their first job. They talk to Gwen and Albert before leaving. In the final chapter, Saldar meets with a mysterious person in Mayor's Cathedral. I won't say who this is though, as that would be a spoiler for a Riyria Revelations book. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to subscribe and watch my other videos to learn more about the world of Elan and Riyria. Thanks!